It'll go live. All right, we are live again for part 2 of our conversation with Melissa Berger today from Thriving with Autism as we launch Autism Awareness Month. So, Melissa, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So we just had a really informative conversation. If you've missed it, make sure that you go back into the Parent Tween Village or Parent Tween community to catch kind of the backstory as to how Melissa navigated this with her daughter. As she says, her story wouldn't exist without her daughter's story. She was diagnosed at 16 with autism, which is fairly late, it feels like. But so we talked about some of Melissa's personal experiences and how those now fall into recommendations for other families. And so now we're talking about meltdowns, and we're going to start from the very beginning. Melissa is very clear that there is a massive distinction between a meltdown and a tantrum. So let's start there.
Okay.
What's the difference?
So I want you to imagine that you're at the grocery store, and either you're there with your own child or you're watching a parent with a child, and the child has reached on to the candy rack and they've grabbed a chocolate bar and they want it. And the parent or the caregiver is drawing a boundary and they say, nope, you can't have that. And the tears come and the kicking and screaming comes and the yelling and all the things, all that acting out. And the parent or the caregiver is just standing there wishing that the ground would swallow them up because they're just, nobody wants to be in that position. What happens is either the child will run out of steam or the parent gives in and they get the candy bar and the tantrum is over. Okay. So that's a tantrum. A meltdown is an overload of the sensory stuff and the nervous system. And it's different because it doesn't just click off when the overload stops. There's a reverberation that continues. And so that's the significant difference between the two.
How does that present if I'm that person watching a family go through this and understanding that given that I'm not a parent, I don't have a clue one way or the other, right? What is that? Is there an obvious distinction of how that shows up, like how that manifests?
It depends on the kid. I mean, again, if you know one autistic child, you know one autistic child. They all react differently. I would say the first thing that I would say to you is if you're witnessing this, the nicest and kindest thing to do is to smile and to give that parent some love across the airs because, it's hard to be in that situation and it's hard to be debating, do I leave my grocery cart full of groceries to take my child to the car because they need to settle down and they need to, get in a tighter space, or what do I do? And so parents are faced with these choices that are really hard. I think maybe the best way to answer that question of what does it look like is to say that it's hard to tell. But what precipitates a meltdown might explain it a little bit. So can I tell you about that a little bit?
Absolutely.
So there's something called cup theory. And what cup theory refers to is imagine that you have two red solo drink cups. Everybody got that picture in your mind? Okay. So what happens is for a neurotypical person, me, you, our cup might start with a drop or two of liquid at the beginning of the day. And as things kind of bother us throughout the day, whether it's, a loud noise or a sunburst coming through the window of the car as we're driving, we might add a drop or two to our cup. But our cup doesn't really ever get full.
Okay.
For a neurodivergent person, they have their cup, and their cup is going to start the day probably already at a third full because they've had to face the loud screaming of the alarm clock. They've had to face bright daylight before they were ready. They've had to navigate through the house, the kitchen, the smells coming from the kitchen or from the bathroom. They've had their clothes that might be uncomfortable or scratching or a tag bothering them. And all of these things are adding and adding and adding to this cup. So the cup is getting sloshy and it's moving around. And now they get out of the house and they go to school and it keeps filling. And the trouble is at school, now they're faced with the fact that they've got all their peers around them and they don't want to fall apart in front of their friends or their kids that they're in class with. So then they're masking and they're hiding and stuffing all of this emotion and all of this stuff that's coming up for them. And it's getting harder and harder and harder. That cup is now like at the top. All it takes is one little more thing or one little other, instance, and it overflows. Now, don't misunderstand me. There isn't one thing that will trigger this. It's a compilation of all of these
All
things
the
going into the
things.
cup. So now you've got an overwhelm, and now you've got a meltdown because that cup has just completely filled up and there's no release. It doesn't pour out, it doesn't empty.
So you've mentioned some of the things that can be triggers. You've mentioned like an auditory stimulus, like with the alarm clock or bright sunshine, um, sensory, like feeling things,
Mhm.
like the tags on the shirt. What are some other ideas? Again, for people who aren't familiar with this, things that like a neurotypical person might be like, God, I can't believe that bothers you. That is
Mhm.
just like, I know for me, if I have two sound, like auditory sources in my space that I'm not paying attention to, i.e., if my husband is watching the television and looking at a reel on his phone, I about lose my mind.
Right, right.
I can handle one
So
background, but I can't handle two. But like, what are some other things that you know that could be
sure,
triggers just for awareness for others?
sure. So, the dishwasher, the sound of the dishwasher running, the hum of the dishwasher, it's just repetitive and
Mhm.
it keeps going and going and going. So that's one. Um, Cookie bags or potato chip bags, that really hard plastic, the crinkle that it makes when you open it or you touch it, that's a trigger sometimes. Um, Aluminum foil, parchment paper. I mean, all sorts of things that you don't necessarily expect to be an issue. I'm trying to think. There are fabrics, certain fabrics will
Mhm.
be problematic. It's endless. I mean, really, it's endless
Okay,
because
so
there are
it's
so many sounds.
well, and given that we have five senses, right? Sight, smell, touch, all the things,
Mhm.
right? Pretty much any of those. What about food? Can food be a trigger?
It can be texturally, some of the textures like yogurt. I mean, things that are. It depends. Every kid is different, but yeah, absolutely. Some kids,
Okay.
have what they call safe foods. They'll eat, five or
Mhm.
six things if they're lucky. Chicken nuggets are always a big one. Some kids can tell when a chicken nugget isn't from the place that they're used to getting it from all the time if it's slightly
Right,
different,
right.
in a way that you might not notice, but they do.
Intriguing. Okay. So then how do we manage these? Okay, if I'm the person at the grocery store, kindness, number one, you know,
Mhm,
and that's actually the second time you've mentioned kindness because you talked about it earlier dealing with practitioners or doctors' offices and trying to
mhm.
trying to get through the cray cray, as it were, of like just trying to get to the providers. But what else can we do in the intermediate time frame with the meltdowns, like to help? I mean, I'd like to think we if we can prevent them on the front end, that would be easier for everyone involved. So let's start there. But then also, if we're not able to prevent it and we get to that space, how do we help mitigate the impact that it creates?
Sure. So, interestingly, classrooms sometimes will have quiet areas with, bean bags or soft furniture, and kids can freely go and sit in those areas, and so that would be one way to find a quiet space. Um, I sort of think maybe it would help to explain a little bit about what happens. So, when a child is melting down, a few different things can happen, and this is just a short list. There are many more possibilities, but they can be staring off in space and just kind of zoning out. They can shut down and stop communicating. They can hold their hands over their ears in an effort to block out whatever noise
Mhm.
is bothering them. They can be rocking, they can be slapping, they can hurt themselves and hit themselves. Sometimes they can hit other people. They can be scrying, that's a good word, screaming or crying.
Right?
um, because basically what's happened is their nervous systems are in a state of fight, flight, or freeze.
Or freeze,
And
right?
all of their coping mechanisms are gone, and they're desperately trying not to melt down. So they're in survival mode. And remember, we don't have a clear trigger. There's not just one thing, it's all of these things coming
Mhm.
together that have created the problem. So, how to sort of gain some control and how to help the child regulate? The first thing is, getting to a quiet space where there's limited stimuli and there's limited stuff to input. And that can be, a quiet room, that can be the car, that can be anywhere where there's quiet. I often think, oh, well, maybe going into a restroom if you're in a public place, but the problem in a restroom is those toilets flush, and that's can be difficult. Um, Offering noise canceling headphones or earplugs is a nice way to, help a little bit. Sometimes compression, so strong hugs, getting
Mm-hmm.
behind somebody and bear hugging them, or weighted blankets, or
Mm-hmm.
even the new plushy weighted stuffed animals that are, they have the weighted butts. That'll help. In some cases, driving in the car, for my daughter, one of the best ways to help her is to get her into the car and just drive. And I have spent hours driving the highways around Boston, helping her get regulated. Um, a big key is not to ask questions. Your child is not capable of processing and
Answering.
answering questions. They just don't have it. And it's also equally important at this point to remember something, and that is after the meltdown has passed and after they're somewhat regulated again, going back and asking what happened, it's not gonna get you anywhere. They're not gonna be able to remember. The best thing for you is to try to think about their day and think about all the things that might be different than a normal day, but
Mm-hmm.
asking them to review it with you isn't likely to get you much information.
Okay, that makes sense because if they've gone into that fight, flight, or freeze, they're not necessarily thinking about what the trigger was. They're just their brain, like they go into the lizard brain, if you will, right? Like the foundational, like I just need to survive brain. Their frontal lobe isn't online, so they may not remember it no
Mhm.
matter what.
Yep, and what's interesting is, I had an experience with my daughter where she had trouble at school, and the guidance counselor had tried everything she could think of to help her. And she finally called me and she said, "Can you possibly come over to school? I don't know how to help my daughter." And so
Hmm.
I went over, and the first thing I did was I grabbed her and I gave her a big bear hug and held on to her. And then I said, "Let's get in the car." And it's very short, "Let's do this, let's do this." And I got her in the car and we drove, and it took about 20 minutes, and she regulated and she got back to being able to communicate, and she said, "Can I please go back to school? I wanna go to my after school thing." And I said, "Okay." And I took her back, and then I called the guidance counselor and I said, "Just so you know, she's back on campus." And she said, "Can I do what you did? Can I give her a hug?" And I said, "Well, you certainly could try, but you need to ask her first if it's okay."
Hmm.
And, that's sort of the realm. And so I think naturally, and I do it even now I do it, I wanna ask questions. I wanna get to the bottom of it. I wanna figure it out. And
Hmm.
I find myself asking the question and then going, "Oh, never mind. I know you can't
Maybe I
answer
shouldn't
that."
have. Right. Maybe I shouldn't have asked. So then we're talking at this point in terms of what the parent can do for the kiddo, but you also mentioned during our first portion of the conversation that you received your diagnosis reasonably late compared to where many other kids are identified. She was 16, she was a junior in high school, she was a year and a half from being able, or like from what the typical American next step is, which is college. And if I'm remembering correctly, she has gone off to college, but she's not exactly around the corner from you. So it's not like you could go like pick her up and be like, "All right, let's go for a drive," like you were able to when she was a little younger. How did you approach um helping her determine those mechanisms? And again, I know it wasn't just you, but you had the team of practitioners who helped her learn about it. But what were some things that you could recommend to somebody else who maybe is in that same space where they don't have the longer ramp up time, as it were, for them to learn about themselves and learn what works for them and how to do that for themselves? Because there's self-care, number one. There's how to do your laundry and brush your teeth and do the things, right? But then there's the level of, I see the meltdown coming. Is that part of it? And or how do I recognize when I'm in this meltdown, and or how do I get myself out of it? Because those are things that she is now largely responsible for on her own.
It sounds sort of too easy, but it's practice and it's, being aware, and it's also self-care, making sure that she's had enough to eat, making sure that she's rested, making sure that she gets exercise so that she can burn energy in a positive,
Hmm.
direction. It's recognizing what the stimuli around her are that are going to
Hmm.
potentially be difficult. It's sticking to a routine. My daughter is one of the most organized and systematic, and she's a planner, and she's thinking long, long range. And
Hmm.
sometimes I'm like, "Stop, you're getting too far ahead of yourself." But those are those are ways that she protects herself, by figuring things out and by working toward knowing what's coming. She also has um, a huge swing chair in her room at school so that she can, it helps with the sensations and the sensory stuff for her to swing in that chair and to be gravity free. So
Hmm.
that helps a lot. Um, Lots of time on the phone. There are nights that she'll call and she'll just say, "Can you just talk to me for a while?" And so I just sit there and talk about the weather and talk about whatever I can think of.
Sure.
Um, I want to be sure that anybody that's listening that has younger children knows that I dealt with meltdowns all through her childhood. I just didn't know what they were. And I thought that they were tantrums. And what I know
Hmm.
now is no, they weren't tantrums. They were actually meltdowns. But I just didn't have a name for it and I didn't understand. And I wish honestly that I had understood,
Hmm.
because then I might have been able to work toward mitigating things and
Sure.
also to be more understanding. One of the biggest things that's important as a parent is keeping your cool, because your energy translates to your kid. And if you're
100%.
dysregulated and you're yelling and you're screaming, that's going to help, that's going right over to them. So
Yeah.
lots of breathing, lots of staying calm, lots of going for walks or whatever helps you stay regulated. But the more calm you are in these circumstances, the better off your chances are of helping your child regulate more quickly.
Awesome. And that's, to your point of, I wish now that I had known earlier what it was, because I might have handled things differently. That's one of the big things that drives the goal here at Parent Tween Connection is education. Like, none of us knows what we don't know. You didn't know
Right.
what you were dealing with. And she was clearly masking effectively and presenting neurotypically enough that any of the people around her, you, her teachers, her pediatricians, like nothing seemed to set off any alarm bells until all of a sudden they did. And the I believe the more knowledgeable and supported parents feel, the better they can connect with and advocate for their kiddos. So that's why I
Mhm.
love having folks like you come in, especially folks who've lived something and then gone forward and said, I want to help other people navigate this more effectively. Like, I recognize how much it would have been useful for me to have a mentor, a guide, a coach, a facilitator, whatever it is. And that now you're providing that because you see how valuable it would have been for you. So thank you on so many levels.
Thank you. It really it comes down to this just incredible feeling I have of, if I can help someone else walk this path more easily, then that's
Mhm.
what I want to do, because life is hard. Let's not kid ourselves. And if I can offer a slightly easier route, I want to do it.
Mhm.
Um, if I may also mention, if this whole conversation of meltdowns has got you thinking and you're wanting more information, I do have a complimentary resource on my website that's called "Turning Traumatizing Meltdowns into Building Blocks and Becoming the Parent That Your Child Needs." And so you can just literally log on to the website, and there's a pop-up, fill it out, and you'll get a copy of it. And it's a workbook that you can work through and think about different situations that you've had with your child and think about what might help in the future.
That's awesome. What a great resource. Awesome. All right. And so folks can find you at melissakberger.com, and
Mhm.
the company's called Thriving with Autism. And anything else that we want to share with parting words?
um I think that the biggest thing is that wherever you are in the journey, you're exactly where you need to be. And don't judge yourself, don't beat yourself up. Just, you are exactly where you need to be, and you are the exact great parent for your child. And it's just a matter of continuing to figure it out and continuing to find resources, and don't be afraid to listen to your gut. When your gut says something's not right, trust that.
Hmm.
And don't be afraid to call it when it's time to move on with a care provider. When a care
Hmm.
provider is no longer being helpful or supporting your child, don't be afraid to pull up and say, okay, we got to move on.
Gotcha. Awesome. Melissa, thank you. I know this is the first
Thank
of
you.
many conversations we're going to have from here until eternity, supporting families. And so thank you so much. Thank you for being educational, and thank you for living your passion. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Have a great one, everybody.